everybody, I'm Krista and this is Krista Reads and Writes. This is my second video and I want to start it the way that I will be starting every video from here on out, which is to recap what my goals were for the past week and then tell you about the progress that I made on those goals. I also real quick want to apologize. I had every intention of having this video done a few days ago. I'm a few days late, basically because of, we'll say, technical issues, technical ignorance on my part. I struggled a little with the videos and some other computer stuff this week, so I finally got to figure it out. So the goal from here on out, though, will be these videos will be no more than 1 week apart. So the goals I had for this past week were to finish reading The Hound of the Baskervilles, to at least start writing something about Franz Kafka and or the Metamorphosis. And then I said I had a half a goal, which was to get back to writing my articles about Mary based on what I learned in the book called The Jewish Roots of Mary. Progress I made on those goals. First, Hound of the Baskervilles, I am almost done. I think I'm on chapter 12 and there's 15 chapters. So I should have this done today or tomorrow. I've really enjoyed this. What I do a lot is I buy a book in paperback. Once in a while, I buy the Kindle version, but usually paperback. I like holding a book. And I read it, and if I like it, then I'll look for it in hardback. I don't want to spend money on something in hardback and then discover I don't like it. But I like the look of hardback book on my shelf 100 times more than a paperback book. So I've liked this one definitely enough to look for a hardback version at some point. And I'll put a couple of links below this video. One is to a website called Abebooks.com. And on there you can find lots of used books that are from, I'll talk in a few minutes about some books I ordered from them this week. And I think one of the books I bought came from a Goodwill in Texas. And I forget, but they're all independent stores, thrift stores. You know, you're not getting it from Barnes and Noble or Amazon. So I like the idea of supporting people like that. So I'll put a link to that below this video. And I also wanted to share that I read Hound of the Baskervilles partly in the physical book and partly in a free audio version that I found on YouTube. That's also a good way to read different new books and do it completely free. It's always a good idea. I think it was my brother actually who showed me that this was even an option. It's always a good idea if there's a book that you want to read to search for the audiobook version on YouTube, and sometimes you can find it there for free, and that was the case with this. And I'll put a link to the audio version that I listened to below this. Even if it's fun sometimes to just go explore what free audiobooks are on YouTube too. You can find, stuff you never would have read otherwise that way sometimes. Okay, so that is the progress on that one. And I'm gonna go a little out of order here because I have the most to say about Franz Kafka and the Metamorphosis this week. So one thing that it wasn't one of my goals for the week, but I talked about last time was Father Brown and G.K. Chesterton. I didn't make a lot of progress on that this week. I did order a couple of Kindle books that I saw mentioned in some of the stuff that I found in my research about Chesterton. Two books that I had seen mentioned in multiple articles that I read were Heretics and The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton. So I did find them on Abebooks. They weren't quite as inexpensive as I would like them to be because I'm cheap. So I decided to check on Amazon, and they actually had Kindle versions of each one of those for 99 cents each. So that's one of those rare occasions when I'll buy something on Kindle. So I got those both on Kindle. I did read a little bit of the Heretics, not the Heretics this week. And it's interesting because I think that a lot of things that I've already seen him talk about in what I've read in Heretics, he talks about it as being relevant to the world in which he's living, which was early 1900s, but it would absolutely still apply to today. So I'm looking forward to talking about that more down the road. Okay, on to Kafka. So I did start, I wanted to go back and reread it, the Metamorphosis. This is the version of that I've got. And I did go back and reread some of it and took some notes, and I did start putting together some notes / an outline for what's probably going to turn into a couple of articles, but we'll see. So I did meet that goal this week, and I wanted to share a little bit of what I've learned or thought about so far. So anything that you read about, at least it's been my experience so far, that anything that I have read so far about, as far as like commentaries or analysis of the Metamorphosis, they all say that the theme of the story, it's about alienation. And I 100% agree with that. I think that's pretty obvious. It's about alienation in a lot of different ways. So it talks about how Gregor kind of felt alienated before his physical change that is covered in the story. Well, and I don't want to say he goes through more of a change than just physical in the story, but before the story even starts, he was alienated. It's obvious that there's even a couple of sentences in one part where it talks about how he's thankful in the course of the story that he locked his doors out of habit every night. So he shares a home with his family, his sister and his mother and father. And he has a habit of every night, I think there's 2 doors to his room. There's one that goes from his room to his sister's room. He always locks that door. And then there's one that goes from his room to like the living area of the house. And he always locks that door too. So he physically isolates himself from his family every night, just as a matter of habit. And he has done that for a long time. And then he also says that he has this same habit when he travels. He's a traveling salesman and he's on the road most of the time. And, it talks about how he locks his doors at the places that he stays. So he has this habit basically of shutting himself away from the world. So that's a thing with him before the story even starts. But then the story talks about his feeling of alienation from his family, which just grows throughout the story. His alienation from himself. And I watched a video that was about the existential meaning of the Metamorphosis. I'll put a link to that below this video too. It was very interesting. And one thing it talks about is how it's also about how it's sort of an exploration of what makes us who we are. So of course he feels alienation from himself because of his physical changes, right? So he wakes up, he's this, the book doesn't say, well, depending on the translation, but the most literal translation doesn't say he's an insect. It says he's a monstrous vermin. So, you know, so he's alienated from his body. But he also has this sense of alienation from just who he is, trying to figure out who he is. Am I a bug? Am I a human being? Do I matter to my sister? Do I matter to my family? He very much feels like, for lack of a better word, a sort of tool for his company. So there's a lot of alienation going on throughout the story, and I'm sure I'll explore that a lot more in whatever I write. And then I wanted to talk about a couple of the commentaries that I read said that, you know, in most stories you read, the climax of the story happens, you know, well into the story. But there are commentaries that say that the climax of this story really happened before the story even starts. And that the metamorphosis is really called the denouement, which is, okay, this climax happens, and then typically it's about the climax happens, and here's how everybody settles into this new world, right? So you've got some kind of conflict going on throughout the story. It builds, it builds, it builds to the climax, and then there's some kind of fallout from the climax. And then the denouement is like the last 10% or so of the story, which explains how everybody settles into the new world, the new context that they're living in. And so the commentaries are saying all that happened before, well, not all that. The climax happened before the story even starts, when he changes into the monstrous vermin. And that the story is really the denouement, the everybody learning of his metamorphosis and going through the process of learning how to live with that. I don't agree. I think that the metamorphosis doesn't refer to, it does refer to Gregor's physical transformation, but it also refers to his internal metamorphosis, and it refers to the metamorphosis of other people in the story. I think the strongest example of that is his sister. I think you say her name Greta. It's Grete. And by the way, I find it interesting that the only other person in the story who has a name is his sister, Greta, and his name is Gregor. So they both start with GRE actually, right? Greta and Gregor. And I think that's because she is the most important person to him in his family. And she certainly seems to be the person who cares the most about his welfare. I'll talk a little bit about that a little more in a minute. But so, and the family unit undergoes a metamorphosis. So, and I think that the climax of this story is an incident that happens when Gregor goes into the living room where his sister's playing the violin, which he loves, and they have lodgers. They've taken in lodgers, and there's a big fallout from that. And I think that's the climax. I don't think the climax happened before the story started. I'll go into that a lot more later too, in my writing and in a video. So I disagree with that one. Another thing that I've seen in several commentaries is looking at Gregor as a Christ figure. And I'm not convinced on this one so far. I see the comparisons. I get the comparisons, but I'm not sold on it yet. So I actually want to read you something out of the book. Let me think. It's at the end of chapter 2. Okay, so let's see, where shall we start? Okay, so in this scene, what happens right before this is basically his father is trying to chase him out of the living area. And then it says, okay, we'll start here. As he, which is Gregor, as he now staggered around, hardly keeping his eyes open in order to gather all his strength for the running, in his obtuseness of not thinking of any escape other than by running, and having almost forgotten that the walls were at his disposal, though here, of course, they were blocked up with elaborately carved furniture full of notches and points. At that moment, a lightly flung object hit the floor right near him and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. A second one came flying right after it. Gregor stopped dead with fear. Further running was useless, for his father was determined to bombard him. He had filled his pockets from the fruit bowl on the buffet and was now pitching one apple after another, for the time being without taking good aim. These little red apples rolled around on the floor as if electrified, clicking into each other. One apple, thrown weakly, grazed Gregor's back and slid off harmlessly. But the very next one that came flying after it literally forced its way into Gregor's back. Gregor tried to drag himself away, as if the startling, unbelievable pain might disappear with a change of place. But he felt nailed to the spot and stretched out his body in a complete confusion of all his senses. With his last glance, he saw the door of his room burst open as his mother rushed out ahead of his screaming sister in her chemise, for his sister had partly undressed her while she was unconscious in order to let her breathe more freely. He saw his mother run up to his father, and on the way, her unfastened petticoat slide to the floor one by one, and saw, as stumbling over the skirt, she forced herself onto his father, and embracing him in complete union with him. But now Gregor's sight went dim. Her hands clasped his father's neck, begging for Gregor's life. And then the next chapter starts with Gregor's serious wound from which he suffered for over a month. The apple remained embedded in his flesh as a visible souvenir, since no one dared to remove it. Seemed to have reminded even his father that Gregor was a member of the family in spite of his present pathetic and repulsive shape. Okay, so there's a lot to talk about in those few sentences, but It's one of the passages that is pointed to in things I've read about Gregor being a Christ-like figure. And that's because of the mention of the apples. So in the creation story in the Bible, it is Adam and Eve eating the apple that gets them banished from the garden. And the suggestion is that the reference to the apple, the choice of an apple is deliberate, and because it is this bombardment with the apples, that number one is what totally banishes him from his family, and number two is what leads to his eventual death, because he's wounded by the apple in his side. The second thing that's pointed to as evidence that he's a Christ-like figure is that throughout the story, he suffers for the sake of his family. Even before the story starts, he's working at a job he hates in order to pay off a debt that his family owes. And also he has this secret plan to save up money from his job to pay for his sister to go, I think it's to music school. He loves his sister. And throughout this story, he does things to keep his family from having to see him. There's one really interesting thing that I want to read to you real quick too. Let's see. It's on page 29 of my book. This is about him and his sister. Okay. This is in chapter 2, I believe. Yes. Okay. One time, it must have been a month since Gregor's metamorphosis, and there was certainly no particular reason anymore for his sister to be astonished at Gregor's appearance. She came a little earlier than usual and caught Gregor still looking out the window, immobile, and so in an excellent position to be terrifying. It would not have surprised Gregor if she had not come in, because his position prevented her from immediately opening a window. But not only did she not come in, she even sprang back and locked the door. A stranger might easily have thought that Gregor had been lying in wait for her, wanting to bite her. Of course, Gregor immediately hid under the couch, right, to keep her from being able to see him. But he had to wait until noon before his sister came again, and she seemed much more uneasy than usual. He realized from this that the sight of him was still repulsive to her and was bound to remain repulsive to her in the future, and that she probably had overcome a lot of resistance not to run away at the sight of even the small part of his body that jutted out from under the couch. The next couple of sentences are what I think are really important. So to spare her even this sight, even the sight of just a part of his body poking out from under the couch, one day he carried a sheet on his back to the couch. The job took 4 hours, and arranged it in such a way that he was now completely covered up, and his sister could not see him even when she stooped. If she had considered this sheet unnecessary, then of course she could have removed it, for it was clear enough that it could not be for his own pleasure that Gregor shut himself off altogether. But she left the sheet the way it was, and Gregor thought that he had even caught a grateful look when one time she cautiously lifted the sheet a little with his head. Gregor thought that he even caught a grateful look when one time he cautiously lifted the sheet a little with his head in order to see how his sister was taking the new arrangement. So he spent 4 hours getting a sheet to in a position that would cover the couch and then fall down enough over the front of it to cover any part of him. And the irony of that is that he did that to encourage his sister to come in to the same room he was in. So to maintain some sense of physical and thus emotional closeness to her, he had to hide himself from her. That's a lot to think about. That's a big alienation example, right? Yes, I want to be close to her, but I know she's repulsed by me. So in order to make her willing to be physically close to me, I'm going to hide myself. So, of course, the suggestion is that his suffering is for the sake of his suffering out of love for other people is analogous to Christ's suffering out of love for mankind. I'm not sold on that at this point, but I might change my mind. I'm going to do a lot more reading, a lot more research. I wrote down a few things that I've learned that I wanted to mention. I mentioned that I bought some books from abebooks.com this week. I bought a diary of his. I think it's from the years 1910 to 1923. He wrote a long letter to his father at one point. I mentioned before he had a really difficult relationship with his father. He basically let it all out in this letter to his father, and he took the letter to his mother, but she never gave it to him. But that letter's been published, and I bought that from Abebooks this week. And I also bought two more books that I'll show you in just a second. I mentioned before that Kafka never had a successful romantic relationship. There was one woman named Felice Bauer, who he was actually engaged to twice. He met her in 1912 when he paid a visit to his friend Max Brod, B-R-O-D, I think that's how you say it, and his wife. He was like immediately head over heels. Well, I won't say immediately because something I read actually showed he was actually very unimpressed with her at first, but by the end of the visit, he was head over heels in love with her, and he wrote her almost every day. His eagerness was not reciprocated. She did write him back, but not nearly as quickly as he would have liked. They saw each other again during Easter of 1913. And then in 1914, July of 1914, he proposed to her in front of his family. But the engagement had been broken off by the end of August. So far, I haven't found out why. They resumed writing letters to each other, though. And they spent 10 days together in Marienbad in July of 1916. Then in July of 1917, they were engaged again. So these are two people who got engaged the first time after just a bunch of letters, basically, and having seen each other maybe twice. And then they got engaged again after spending 10 actual days together and, months of writing each other. That same year, 1917, he eventually died of tuberculosis, and he started having symptoms of tuberculosis in 1917. And by December, he had broken off the engagement again because he was so sick. Then there were two other women. One I don't know that much about yet. One was Melina Jasinka, who was a married woman. She did love Kafka, but she was not happy in her marriage, but she did love her husband, and she wasn't willing to leave him for Kafka. And then the last woman he had a relationship her name was Dora Diamant. She was much younger than him. She was 19 when they met, and he was 39. They lived together in Berlin, and then moved to Palestine in 1923. They stayed there for 6 months and had a very hard time financially. He was getting sicker and sicker and was finally convinced to go to the hospital. Then in mid-March, can't tell if this was, it was in 1924. In mid-March of 1924, he went to stay with his friend Max Brod for a while. But Dora stayed behind. They had returned to Berlin by now. So he left Berlin. He went to stay with his friend for a while, and Dora stayed in Berlin until they both went to Austria together. And they were there for 3 months until he died. And she stayed there and took care of him during those last 3 months of his life. So 2 of the books that I bought are letters to these women. This one is his books to Felice. And then a much shorter one, which is his letters to Melina. I'm hoping that through reading all these letters in his diary that I'll learn a little more about who he is and learn a little bit more about whether I believe that he intentionally created Gregor, some kind of Christ figure, or any more insights to themes or things he was trying to say through the Metamorphosis. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about won't take too long. One book I talked about last time that I said was one of my all-time favorites is the one that I want to get back to writing articles about, Jesus and the Jewish Roots of Mary. And I marked a page in here. I want to read you just a few things from this book to give you a better idea of what it's about. So in the introduction to the book, he talks about he's been Catholic all his life. His wife, when they met, she was not Catholic. I think she was Baptist. I can't find it. Let's see. Yeah, her family was Baptist, which didn't cause an issue for them when they were dating. But once they became engaged and they went to pre-marriage counseling with her pastor, it became an issue for everybody, including him. It made him start thinking about things he hadn't thought about before. The Baptist pastor was really direct and said things like, how can Catholics believe that Mary was sinless? That's downright unbiblical. And, just really questioned him and pushed him on some of these things. And he didn't really know the answers. He'd been Catholic his whole life. He'd learned these things in Catholic schools, but he'd never bothered to research why they believed these things. So he went to Notre Dame, And let me just read this real quick. It says most PhD programs in biblical studies tend to specialize in either the New Testament or the Old Testament. At Notre Dame, however, the doctoral program was titled Christianity and Judaism in Antiquity. This meant that all PhD students in biblical studies were required to take courses in both the New Testament and the Old Testament, both Greek and Hebrew, both early Christianity and ancient Judaism. Okay, and then he says, in the course of my studies, I learned 3 things that completely changed the way I saw Mary. First, I learned that Catholic beliefs about Mary are deeply rooted in ancient Christianity. That's one thing I mentioned in my last video. And then he talks a little more about that. And then he says, second, I gradually understood that these ancient Christian beliefs about Mary flowed directly out of what early Christians believed about Jesus. In the words of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, quote, what the Catholic faith believes about Mary is based on what it believes about Christ, and what it teaches about Mary illumines in turn its faith in Christ. I cannot overemphasize the significance of this principle. If you want to understand what the Bible teaches about Mary, you have to make sure you begin with what it teaches about Jesus. Third, and most important of all, I discovered that ancient Christians got their beliefs about Mary from the Old Testament, not just the New Testament. In fact, the key to understanding what the Bible teaches about Mary can be found in what is called typology, the study of Old Testament prefigurations and their New Testament fulfillments. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to skip some and go to this on the next page. Eventually, it dawned on me that the reason I had begun to consider Catholic beliefs about Mary unbiblical was that I was not paying enough attention to the Old Testament. And it wasn't just me. The more I read, the more I began to notice that virtually every book on Mary that rejected her sinlessness, perpetual virginity, bodily assumption, and other Catholic beliefs as unscriptural would invariably ignore the Old Testament. This is a big problem. You simply cannot understand Mary without looking at her in her first century Jewish context. Scholars today agree that Jesus can be fully understood only from within the Judaism of his day. However, when it comes to Mary, the same rule does not seem to apply. Over and over again, books about Mary that are critical of Catholic beliefs completely ignore the Old Testament, to say nothing of ancient Jewish traditions outside the Bible. But if you're going to understand what the Bible really teaches about Mary, you can't just study the New Testament. It's not enough. You've got to go back to the Old Testament. You have to try to see both Jesus and Mary through ancient Jewish eyes. And that, to me, is the heart of what the rest of this book is about. And it does go all the way back. I think that the first chapter of this goes all the way back to Eve, and how Mary is, how Catholic beliefs about Mary are in part related to Eve. So anyway, great book that I will write and talk much more about. So I guess what's left to do is set my new goals. One is to finish this, which shouldn't take me long. Let's see, 2 is to continue researching Franz Kafka and the Metamorphosis, and working on writing something about them. And See, this is where I get tricked up. So what's happening now is I'm getting pulled into Mary, but I also am still interested in Chesterton. So this is where things fall apart for me somehow, sometimes. Is I go to one and totally forget the other one. Okay, so I'm gonna do 3.5 this week. Okay, let's see how this goes. I'm gonna start again. This will not take me long. Okay, so I'll finish this. We'll consider that a half goal because that's not going to take long. The Kafka and Metamorphosis research is going to take a while. I expect that's for weeks to come. That's going to be on the list. So that's a goal. Let's say I will at least start on something about this, about the next chapter in this book. I don't even know how far into the book I got with the articles I'd written before. So I need to look at that and then pick up where I left off. I will at least start on that. And I will continue my research on Chesterton and Father Brown. I think that's it for now. I will be back. Today is Sunday, August 29th, I believe. This video will either get posted tonight or tomorrow, just depends on the whole technology thing, basically. So I will record another video no later than a week from today, which will be September 5th, I believe, the day before Labor Day. And I'll do the same thing. I'll restate what my goals were for the week, give you a progress report, talk about some things I've been working on, things I'm learning, and then set some new goals. So that will be what you'll see next. As always, if you have any comments, questions, suggestions, if I said something and you were like, you're totally wrong on that, I'd like to hear that stuff. Anything, any kind of feedback, I would love to hear. And I think that's it. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in a week. Bye-bye. Happy reading.